I'm going to talk a bit about housing plus transportation affordability indices and just two acknowledgments before I begin. One, I want to acknowledge my co-author, Mariel Kirshen, who's a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania. And then I want to acknowledge Scott Bernstein as well. So we have the creator of the Transportation and Affordable Index here in the room. And he's already given me several comments. I will try to respond to those comments in the talk, but don't hesitate to. Excellent. So I want to give this talk in 5 parts. First, I just want to give a quick overview of the theory and of the index itself. Then I'm going to talk briefly, very briefly, about how the index is calculated. So there are a number of slides. I'll go over it fairly quickly. We can come back to it if there are questions. And Scott could probably actually answer these questions better than I could as well. Next, I want to talk about some challenges and critiques. I want to look at an application to Mexico City. And before getting to Mexico City, I'm going to talk a bit about how this could be transferred to Mexico and whether it could, so a national translation and then a city translation. And then finally, I want to conclude just talking a little bit about where, how, and what the benefits are of transferring this to other OECD countries. So the relationship between transportation and housing costs is very well known. It's central to urban theories about where households locate, where firms locate. This is just a simplified graph showing as you get further from the city center, housing costs tend to go down. And often kind of closer to the city center, you won't see that much housing at all because you'll have offices are more valuable. So offices will price out housing in the closest areas to the center. We also know that transportation costs tend to go up as people move into the periphery. Locations are less dense. There tends to be a less attractive mix of land uses. So even if you're going to go shopping, instead of walking to a store, a neighborhood corner store, you may have to drive to a large shopping center. So we know that this relationship exists, and we also know that it's pretty powerful. So the H plus T Affordability Index essentially is a way to try and think about the relationship between housing and transportation costs when considering whether an area is affordable for a household. So traditionally in the US, we view housing as affordable if a household is spending 30% or less of its income on housing. And this comes out of some public policy, some federal legislation. It actually started out at 25%. So it's kind of there's a popular saying, a week's wages for a month's rent. So that was essentially, as a worker, you should have a right to your housing based on work, spending a quarter of your income. That's increased over time. So the H plus T Affordability Index essentially accounts for transportation costs as well. So a neighborhood is considered affordable, or a house is considered affordable if a household spends 45% or less of its income on housing and transportation. So just to give a few examples, this is an example from my current hometown, Philadelphia. So on the left, there's a map of the regions that are most affordable to households based just on housing, and on the right accounts for housing plus transportation. And the map actually doesn't change that much. Philadelphia as a region remains relatively kind of affordable to a median income household, whether you're accounting for housing costs or transportation costs or just housing costs. Although you can see in both instances, it gets progressively more expensive to live in the suburbs. Similarly, here's another view of transportation in Washington, D.C., where it does not change that much. Although you see some areas, some pockets around transit where it's a little bit more affordable as you incorporate housing and transportation costs. Some cities you see a very stark difference. So this is an example from St. Louis, where when you account for transportation costs, areas outside of the center start to look substantially more expensive. So not thinking about transportation costs, you could wind up placing, say, public housing or subsidized housing in an area that's not particularly affordable. So how is this calculated? Essentially, the index is pretty simple. You just take a household income or a regional income, and you divide through by housing costs plus transportation costs. And you'll see actually calculating that is a little bit more complicated. So this is an equation from the Center for Neighborhood Technologies, where household transportation costs are essentially a function of the percentage of people in a neighborhood that travel by different modes times the cost of traveling by those modes. To see this in another, this is from the CNT's website, each neighborhood, the costs are predicted based on a number of publicly available data sources, so neighborhood characteristics such as gross density, population density, that is, the intensity of households, the fraction of housing units that are single-family detached. So that's used to predict the percentage of auto ownership, auto usage, and public transit use at a neighborhood level. So this is not an individual level, but a neighborhood or metropolitan level. Going into this in a little bit more detail, so looking first at car ownership costs, the index estimates car ownership as a function of some neighborhood characteristics. So what percentage of people own cars? And it's important to note that in these estimates, the estimates occur for 5 different income groups. So it's not predicted based on the income of people living in a neighborhood. It's based on regional median incomes. So the prediction is not for, okay, rich people live in a rich neighborhood, therefore they spend a lot on transportation. The average costs of car ownership are also broken down by income group, and these are from the 2005 to 2010 consumer expenditure surveys, and then you multiply the first by the second to get an estimate of total costs. So how many cars on average do people have in a neighborhood, and how much does it cost to own a car? The estimate for vehicle travel is quite similar. It's based on odometer readings from Illinois, and similar predictor variables, also using multivariate or ordinary least squares regression, and using the consumer expenditure survey to estimate how much it costs to operate a vehicle, multiplying the two together based on a typical regional household. And anytime I say typical, I mean median. So typical. And then finally, transit costs. This is probably the most complicated of the calculations, just because we don't collect as good data on transit. So this is the percent commuting to work is estimated. This is based off of the census. So Alan gave us an overview of this data earlier today. And then this is matched to a database on national transit use, which is then matched to open source data on where transit stations are located in the United States. So kind of the amount from the National Transit Database, you can get the total amount of fares that are spent on transit, and then the index takes that and spreads it out to neighborhoods based on where people use transit, or an approximation of that. And then divides total fare revenue from a block group by the households in a block to get an estimate of how much a typical regional household would spend on transit in a different neighborhood. So we can come back to this if any of this is unclear. So this has had quite an impact on public policy. So the Center for Neighborhood Technology provides a list, and Scott, during the discussion section, I'd love to hear more about some of these policies. But some examples, Chicago used it for the regional transportation plan to determine kind of where they want to have housing grow. So in order to have a more livable region, they've also used it for determining where they might put BRT corridors. The idea being you want to locate BRT in a place where you're going to reduce household expenditures for at-risk households. I'm just going to go through these quite quickly. Also used quite frequently by housing professionals. So to determine essentially where to locate affordable housing. The current, actually I'll talk about it in the section on policy, but just a few examples. So in San Francisco, the MTC used the index to establish its transit-oriented development housing fund. So they want to encourage affordable housing around transit. They want to encourage more housing in areas where households' commuter expenses are going to be lower. Policymakers, I want to talk a little bit more about the bottom one, the low-income housing tax credit. So this is the primary source of funding for affordable housing in the United States. It's allocated on a state-by-state basis, and it's allocated competitively. So different affordable housing developers will have a project, so they may have access to land, and they will have a proposal. And in that proposal, they go through and they submit an application to the state. And that application is based on how much housing they're going to provide, at what level of affordability. And a number of states also think about location. So Massachusetts, California, to cite a few examples, there's probably about 10 to 15 states that use some measure of where the housing is located to give points on a competitive bid for government money to build affordable housing. So it winds up having quite an effect in terms of where subsidized housing gets built in these states. Because in many states, these are quite competitive. These are competitive grants. If you are not putting forward a competitive project, you're not going to get financing. If you do not get government financing, you're not going to be able to build the subsidized housing. It's also had an effect on federal policy. So the Partnership for Sustainable Communities, which is a partnership between 3 government agencies, Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Transportation, and the Environmental Protection Agency have partnered. They use the CNT's tool. So you can go through and look at regional affordability. And you can also go through, there's a calculator for individuals. So if you're an individual thinking about where you want to live, you can use this tool to either get estimates of the average costs or actually put in your costs. So you can say, oh, this is how much I'm probably going to spend on transportation. This is how much I think housing is. And it gives you a spreadsheet. It spits it out so that you can be more informed about where you want to choose to reside. I think one of the most important uses, I apologize, this is probably a little small to read, so I'll talk about it in a little detail, is just changing narratives about affordability. So on the left, there is kind of this ranks cities, so municipalities, by how affordable they are based on the median income in that region and based on whether you look at just housing or you look at housing plus transportation. So I think Alan will be very surprised to hear that if you look at housing plus transportation, Washington, D.C. winds up being the most affordable of these cities. And part of that is just rich people live in Washington, D.C. So that this is cities on the left, and then on the right is metros. So Washington, D.C., both the city and the metro rank number 1. And you can see there are some cities that just drop a lot in the rankings. So you look at New York City. And in terms of housing affordability, New York City is towards the bottom of the list at 17. But public transit in New York City is very good. So the expenses of owning a car are very low. Most or many households do not own cars, and it's easier to get by. So it jumps from 17th place to 6th place when you consider housing plus transportation. And this type of information is really important. The press uses this to talk about relatively where do we want to grow? What are the benefits of being in a more affordable region in terms of transportation expenditures? So there are a few critiques and challenges of these indices. I'm gonna walk through these with a little bit more detail. And Scott, feel free to jump in as well if you have any critiques of my critiques or comments. One of the first is affordability is it's kind of a rule of thumb. It's a general term. This isn't a specific problem to a housing plus transportation affordability index. It's a critique of rules of thumb in general. So the threshold is somewhat arbitrary, 30%. It used to be 25% for housing. Is there really a difference between a household that spends 29% of its income on housing versus 31%? It also doesn't really consider other measures of affordability, and these tend to vary with geography as well. So groceries were mentioned. It's a lot more expensive to buy groceries in Paris than it is in suburban St. Louis. You probably get much better groceries in Paris, so you're buying quality. But school in the United States, public school, is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Many suburban areas have very good quality public schools, and many urban areas with good transit connections do not. There was a recent estimate in a book that the United States is one of only 2 OECD nations that spends more public money on wealthy public school students than on poor public school students. So we tend to kind of channel these funds. And local schools are very much determined by local political geographies. So you may find that actually things are quite a bit more affordable if you have kids and you account for housing, transportation, and school costs. The index ignores household size, age, composition. Life stage is really important. So if you look at, say, a college student, they may be spending 90% of their income on housing, and they're taking out loans. They may even be spending kind of more income than they have on housing, but that's because they have expectations of making money in the future. Kind of at the opposite end, you have older households who often are reliant on the wealth they've accumulated in their house to survive. So you would really want, you don't really care if a young household is spending 50% of its income on housing, provided that they have good future earnings prospects, but you might care a lot if an older household does.
I just might jump in there. On the third one, to be specific, the regression model is constructed holding household size, income, and the number of commuters per household constant to make the scores comparable between what we've called neighborhoods, which are really census block groups. So when you're trying to compare 180,000 different places to each other, you have to keep something constant, and that was what was available, and that's what we went for. Also, we did it because the first study you cited in there that we did with this guy, John Holtzclaw, whose curve you showed, seemed to indicate that if we went to that scale, all other things being equal, that doing it that way, holding those things constant, explained more of the observed variation in travel demand and associated costs than the previous studies, which were based on holding neighborhood characteristics constant and varying household income, size, and stage of life, and so forth. We got twice the explanatory power our way. And so it's not that people with more income don't spend more money. As Alan pointed out, people will spend more money on cars if they have it, and so forth. But based on characteristics, you end up with bands of costs holding those things constant. And that's helpful then in terms of targeting a policy locally. So
I'm sorry, this is a little different. This is more about the theoretical, what is affordability? And if that 30% threshold, that 45% threshold, it varies. It's important to different people in different ways, and they vary systematically.
So I agree with you then and say that these are the characteristics of place-based indexes.
Good. That's fine. Yep. And then finally, and this relates to the exact same point, variation in household preferences is not accounted for. So you can't do everything with an index. You're summing things up. So it's not a critique. It's a challenge. I guess for me, one of the biggest critiques is a problem of aggregation bias. And I'm going to show this. I'm going to try and explain it with an example of two types of neighborhoods. Pretend these neighborhoods have the exact same median housing prices. The one on the left has a lot more variation. So there are housing units that are affordable to poor people. There are housing units that are luxury that a wealthy person might want to live in. And on the right, everything is the same. What we really want is to be able to match households to housing units. So what we care about is not necessarily median housing price. And again, this is an important way we need to aggregate up to have indices that are useful. But it also creates some bias, some problems. So there may be some areas that look affordable, but they're actually fairly unaffordable. And we may see some neighborhoods that look extremely unaffordable, but they have a high proportion of affordable housing, which as a homeowner, you probably actually want to be in a neighborhood that has the highest median home price possible. You just want to have a house you can afford. So you want to be around people that are wealthier than you, all things being equal. And that shows up in preferences as well. So one critique, and Scott has corrected me on this, is the VMT estimation is based on a single region rather than the nation. So it's unsure kind of whether the prediction of VMT can be applied to the country. Scott told me it's now been validated using the National Household Travel Survey. And I think you said the overestimation was about 8% across the sample, which is pretty good. And
yeah, that's correct. So if you go to HTAindex.org right now, if you go to HTAindex.org right now, the new model is based on the National Household Travel Survey, and there is an 8% difference in VMT, which is a trivial difference in cost, actually, but it's important for transportation planning purposes. So Illinois did turn out to produce the same shape of a curve, but it had to be recalibrated for the country as a whole. So
And that could also be its different sources of data as well. So one's based on odometer readings, one's based on estimate. There are all kinds of, but that's...
Each state and FBO has different levels of granularity and the districts that they're using to do it.
And this is only going to get more problematic when we talk about extending this to other countries where everyone estimates these things a little bit differently. One critique is one of the focuses of the policy has been on building construction around transit stations, and new construction is really expensive. It can also be fairly time-consuming. This is an example. This is MacArthur Transit Village around a BART station in Oakland. So this took about 30 years of planning. It's expensive to build. So even the kind of units that are affordable to a moderate income household, 80% of area median income, is requiring a lot of subsidy because it costs a lot to build new housing, and it costs a lot to build new housing in these attractive areas next to transit. It's also, depending on what you're building, you may find that households, because it's more expensive, if it's market rate, you're going to have wealthy households that tend to move to it. So housing prices have been shooting up in Oakland and throughout the Bay Area. And mostly wealthier households are moving into these. So it may not be poor households that are benefiting from this policy, even if that's part of the intention is to improve affordability conditions for poorer households. This is a map from Houston, and this shows where affordable housing is located by race. So the whiter areas, the clearer areas, are where there are higher concentrations of black households, and most of the affordable housing has been concentrated in these areas. This led to a recent Supreme Court case and a Supreme Court ruling, and this comes up a lot in discussions about affordable housing, whether we want affordable housing in areas that have good access, where there are high concentrations of need, or whether we want affordable housing in suburban areas where you might have better schools and you might be surrounded by wealthier households. So this is part of a larger debate, but it's certainly one of the critiques of using these place-based indices to locate affordable housing. So talking about applying the index to Mexico City, one of the first questions that I wanted to look at was how readily could this be applied in Mexico? And actually in Mexico it would be quite difficult. There's good data on household consumer expenditures. So INEGI, the statistics agency, keeps very good data, very high quality data, actually a fairly refined spatial unit you can get it at as well. But VMT data is extremely difficult to come by. And so is car ownership data, because it's not asked about in the census. Beginning in 2000, they asked whether households owned one or more cars. And prior to 2000, there was no question on car ownership. There's also not a question on income that's as regionally refined. So I tried applying it to Mexico City and using a 2007 household travel survey, which contains information on rents and contains information on VMT, or I was able to estimate that by matching trips and driving rates. At the same time, for this analysis, I wound up dropping car ownership. Part of the reason poorer households tend not to drive in Mexico City, and you get some real spatial differences. So in Mexico, wealthy households tend to locate in the center, and they tend to own and use cars. So you wind up, if you accounted for car ownership, you would wind up actually estimating that the transportation costs in the center are higher because you have more people using cars in the center. So I focused on households that didn't drive on the survey day. That's roughly 2/3 of all the households in the sample. So it's a sample of about 42,000 households. For those of you who don't know, I feel like I don't need to go over this in the room, but here's Mexico City, the political, geographic, and social capital of Mexico. It's about 20%, a little bit less than 20% of the national population, and it produces about a quarter of GDP. Here's a plot of how much non-driving households kind of income by distance to the center. So I define the center as the central Zocalo, where the government offices are, and you also have a fairly high concentration of offices nearby. Most households live within about 35 kilometers within the metropolitan area. And you can see, as you would expect, you have kind of rents go up a little bit, a little outside of the city, and then they go down. And they kind of flatten out as you get into the far periphery. And also transit expenditures, they go up. So you go further out and transit expenditures increase. So we're seeing this manifestation of the housing transportation connection. Yes?
Just for clarity, when you say transit, you mean transportation?
No, I mean transit. This is all public transit expenditures. So there's no inclusion of driving costs in this data. So this is excluding the third of households that drove on the survey day. So using this data, I'm going to show a few different ways that we could characterize affordability. I guess another important note is I aggregated this up to the municipality level, which is substantially larger than a block group. It shows up a little bit better in the maps, and it's also based on a smaller sample than the census, so it shows up a bit better. So this is the proportion of rent-burdened households by municipality. So this is a way to look at individual and aggregate affordability at the same time. So you'll see in the center, we have a lot of households that are rent-burdened. So this is where the housing is most expensive. We got 40 to 50% in the most central areas of the city. And then as you get out into the periphery, fewer and fewer households as a percentage of the total number of households are rent-burdened. If we add transportation costs, we see that the center becomes relatively more affordable. So still in the very center, we've got about 40 to 50% of households are rent burdened. So it's an expensive area. But then in the kind of just outside of the center, we see higher amounts of households are able to match to affordable locations. Another way to look at this is taking a low-income household. So this is a metropolitan household earning the 25th percentile of income. So kind of a fairly poor household, and looking just at housing, what areas are affordable. So there's actually nothing in the federal district, or very little, that is affordable, and you have to go out into the periphery to find a housing unit that is affordable, an average neighborhood that is affordable. If we account for transportation, it actually gets even less affordable, because these suburban areas are the expensive areas of the city in terms of using transit. So you actually only have a few areas that are not too expensive on average for a typical 25th percentile income household. A very different way to cut this is to look at that same household and look at what's the percent of housing that's affordable. And actually, I was a little bit surprised by this. Affordability, even in kind of some of these central expensive areas, you have decent amounts of affordable housing. So there is a stock that's affordable within these areas. So it's not great, but households are able to match. And as you get out into the periphery, it's well over 50%. And again, this is not a median income household. This is a pretty poor household, earning the 25th percentile of median income. And accounting for transportation costs as well, it looks even better. So more and more of the central areas. So this is a common theme in the United States as well as in Mexico. So Mexico is the poorest OECD nation. The US is one of the wealthiest. They're probably similarly car dependent in some ways, both in North America. But the fact that we're seeing the same patterns in these cities, I think, shows that the index will tend to result in the same overall conclusions. So summary of the findings, it's definitely possible to apply this index in a place like Mexico City, at least when excluding car expenses. And actually, you could estimate car expenses relatively easily. I've done a model predicting VMT, but it was used for something else, so I didn't want to apply it to this. More transit-friendly central locations are relatively more affordable when accounting for travel costs. No big surprise there. But the shortage of necessary data makes it pretty hard to extend this to the rest of the country. A few policy takeaways. So I've been talking about this policy with a few of you over the break. Affordable housing policy in Mexico has really shifted over the last 20 years, where instead of small entrepreneurs or households building in informal settlements, the country has largely shifted to a model of building massive publicly subsidized housing units through a provident fund. And these are generally on the periphery, and they tend to have much. So I used Google Maps to look at the kind of what areas fell in a commercial housing development and what kind of areas fell just out, looking at the household travel survey. And the households in a traditional informal settlement own a lot fewer cars, they drive a lot less, they tend to be poorer, but only a little bit poorer. So there's something about the form of these as well. So not just the location, but the form that is increasing car ownership and car travel, and that's much more expensive. So if you're switching from transit to car ownership and car use, you're spending a lot more. There's also been very, very limited investment in suburban public transit in Mexico City, and I would argue in most cities around the world. So this is a map of how much households spend on average on transit in pesos, and households in the periphery spend a lot more. They tend to take informal transit, they may have 1 or 2 transfers, and then they link up to the metro, which is cheaper and faster, often to get to central locations. There have been a few investments into the suburbs, so up at the top of that northeast line, there's now a BRT line that runs a little bit north and then to the west. But nearly all of the investment that's happened since this survey was done in 2007, there's been a metro line built here in the center. There's been an entire BRT network. So there was one BRT line at the time of this survey. Now I think there's about 150 kilometers of BRT. It's all in the center. And you actually have more people living in the suburbs than you do in this area, and they're more transit reliant. So they're using transit for a higher proportion of trips and a higher total number of trips than those in the center. So a few concluding remarks on transferability. There's some real value to these indices, and I think it can strengthen the public and policymakers' understandings of which countries, cities, and regions are most affordable. So when you're thinking about where is a good place to live, the same way that I showed the index used to show Washington, D.C. is a lot more affordable than we might think of it if we just look at housing costs, we can apply it across OECD countries and cities and think about affordability a little bit more broadly. It can also be used to encourage bank lending and the construction of affordable housing in neighborhoods with higher land costs but lower transportation costs. I think that's tremendously important in Mexico City. It's been a little bit of a crazy policy to subsidize so much peripheral housing, and it was really a problem in the recent financial crisis where there were mass abandonments of mortgages. So these are subsidized housing, but you have a mortgage, and homeowners just walked away because their transportation costs got too high, they lost their jobs, and they abandoned peripheral units in particular en masse. And then I think that we really need to think more broadly about, as transportation planners, engineers, investors, we need a better suburban transit model, and we don't really have it. So we've been building some fairly expensive commuter rail projects. We need something that works for the 11 million people that live in Mexico City's suburbs. And we've got one fairly expensive BRT line, so that, I think if you go the full length of that, that costs about 20 pesos compared to now 5 for the full 225 kilometer metro. And the commuter rail is quite expensive as well. And you have to transfer from both to get to your final destination. So you're going to pay a more expensive trip, and then you're going to transfer to the metro, pay the metro, and then maybe also take an informal transit vehicle to your final destination. So we need a better model, and I think that holds true across a variety of cities and countries. So thank you. Sorry, a few more. So I already mentioned this, but if we factored in car costs, the center would look relatively more expensive, not relatively less expensive, and that's just because households in the center own more cars and drive more on average. So there's some similar differences when comparing American and European cities. There's a famous paper that asks, why do the poor live in central Detroit and the rich live in central Paris? And it's about amenities, so there's a lot of variation in cities, what a city's like, where wealthy households choose to live, and then kind of the remaining space that poor households get left with. And then, again, schools. So the school system is so different in the United States, and that's really going to vary by countries. And that's one of the big, challenges with thinking about the relationship between housing and transportation costs in the U.S. is often we have higher housing costs, lower transportation costs, but way higher public school costs because a lot of households choose to send their kids to private school instead. A few other challenges: the data aren't always available, or they come in a different form in nearly every city. So there's not going to be an easy way to apply this to all OECD countries uniformly. And that's particularly problematic for predicting VMT. So predictions of VMT are going to vary substantially from city to city and country to country. So thank you very much. I look forward to your comments and questions.